Chapter 5, A Geopolitical Reflection. Here I was, at age 25, a refugee in a new country. As the Tibetan saying goes, as a refugee, the only thing that was familiar to us was the earth and the sky. At that time, it was impossible to grasp the full significance of what had happened to my homeland in a global historical context. Predictably, the first and foremost experience for me and my fellow Tibetans was the shock of displacement. The immediate task, in the wake of my escape, was the very opposite of deep reflection, the urgent work of looking after the growing and desperate community of tens of thousands of refugees who managed to follow me over the course of several months into exile. Only later, with the benefit of time and hindsight, did it become possible for me to come to some more general reflections on the meaning of what has happened to Tibet. Tibet, my homeland I had been forced to flee, is a landlocked country with the huge Himalayan mountain range to the south, beyond which are India, Nepal, and Bhutan, the deserts of Central Asia to the north, past which lie East Turkestan, Xinjiang, and Mongolia, and to the east the lowlands and rice fields inhabited by the Chinese. We Tibetans, the inhabitants of the vast Tibetan plateau, are semi-nomadic eaters of tsampa, roasted barley flour, occupying a vast high-altitude plateau, rimmed to the south by the mighty Himalayas beneath a deep blue sky. Ancient texts describe the land in terms of high peaks and pure earth, and trace the origin of the meat-eating, red-faced race of Tibetans to the union of a monkey and a rock-dwelling ogress to which were born 6 children. From these sprang the Tibetan people, according to this story of origin. I first heard this story as a child after my arrival in Lhasa. A monk told it to me, explaining a mural inside the Potala Palace showing the monkey. Tibetan histories identify Tibet's first king as Nyatri Tsempo, whose reign began in 127 BCE. In fact, one traditional Tibetan calendar system, Burgyalo, Tibetan royal year, takes this to be year 1, making 1950, when communist China invaded Tibet, year 2077 on the Tibetan calendar. An early chronicle says that this king descended from heaven and went of his own accord to become the lord of all under heaven. To the center of the earth, in the heart of the continent, in the enclosure of snow mountains, at the head of all rivers, where the mountains were high, the earth pure, the country fine, a place where swift horses flourished. Given the Tibetan Plateau's exceptional geography, which we often refer to as the roof of the world, Zamling Sayi Yangthok, the Tibetans developed a lifestyle and culture over millennia that was uniquely adapted to the high-altitude environment and ecology. We Tibetans recognize the 7th century Emperor Songtsen Gampo to be our greatest king, crediting his reign with a series of landmark achievements that enriched Tibetan civilization. It was during his rule that the current Tibetan writing system was invented, and that the first Buddhist texts were brought from India to be translated from Sanskrit. The emperor established a universal legal system, standardized forms of measurements across the Tibetan plateau, and brought about many innovations to agriculture and craftsmanship. It was also during his reign that 2 of Tibet's oldest temples, the Jokhang and Ramosh, were built to house 2 sacred statues of the Buddha brought from Nepal and China by the 2 princesses whom Emperor Songtsen married. Even as a child, I knew the tale of the ancient marriage between Songtsen Gampo and the Chinese Princess Wencheng, given as a bride by the Tang Emperor Taizong. Every summer, I would look forward to the Shoton Festival in Lhasa, during which Tibetan operas were performed in the garden outside the Norbolinka Palace. One of the famous operas tells the story of Songtsen's marriage to this Chinese princess and also to a Nepalese princess called Brikuti. Like many ancient neighbors with a long history, there have been ups and downs in the engagement between Tibet and China. Periods of friendship, periods of cool tolerance, periods of bickering, and times of outright conflict. However, Communist China's forcible invasion of Tibet marked an unprecedented tragedy for the Tibetan people. Looking back, I have come to understand the ways Tibet and its people were the victims of tragic circumstances of history. The major powers that had historic connections with Tibet were all preoccupied in very particular ways during the crucial period. Great Britain, which had, after all, invaded Tibet in 1903 to 1904, had just given up India and had no stomach for the politics of South and Inner Asia. India had become independent on August 15, 1947, in the midst of a most traumatic partition, and almost immediately in October of that year was caught up in war with the newly partitioned Pakistan, lasting till January 1st, 1949. There was no appetite for further conflict with another neighbor right next to the arena of the former war. The United States had become interested in Tibet as part of its concern to stop the spread of communism after the end of the Second World War. The last thing it wanted to see was a repeat in Asia of what had happened in Eastern Europe in the immediate aftermath of that war. During the Civil War in China from 1946 to 1949, for example, the United States gave significant support to the losing nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek. In the 1950 to 1953 Korean War, the United States committed troops on the ground to help defend South Korea from the communist invasion from the north, the latter backed by the Soviet Union and Communist China. What little support the United States extended to the Tibetan resistance was largely motivated by the broader policy to stem the tide of communism in Asia. What happened to Mongolia around the same period is a profoundly interesting historical point of contrast. When the Manchu Qing dynasty fell in 1911, the political status enjoyed by Mongolia was exactly parallel to that of Tibet. Just as nationalist China was claiming Tibet to be part of its territory, so too did it claim Mongolia. It is no coincidence that Mongolia and Tibet made a bilateral treaty reiterating each other's independence in 1913. Because the Soviet Union backed Mongolia's independence from China following a referendum in 1945, the world powers persuaded Chiang Kai-shek to accept the result of that vote. As a consequence, although reduced in size, Mongolia is now an independent country and a member of the United Nations. We Tibetans were not so lucky. To some extent, we have ourselves to blame, while the rest of the world was waking up to the significance of global understanding about the place of nations, especially in the wake of the First World War. We Tibetans had buried our heads in the sand. Significant mistakes were made during this period. For example, too few systematic initiatives were taken during this crucial period to express Tibet's status as an independent country at the international level. The 13th Dalai Lama's measures for reform, especially in education and defense, were largely thwarted by various sectional interests and elites. After his death in 1933, efforts could have been made to join international forums such as the League of Nations and later the United Nations. The crucial point that Tibet's ruling elite, with the exception of the 13th Dalai Lama, simply did not grasp was that in the new political reality of the 20th century, it was not adequate for a country to enjoy independence. It had to make a series of international gestures to prove its presence on the world stage as one among many sovereign states. It was particularly unfortunate that, while the storm was gathering around Tibet, the ruling elite, including my two successive regents, were largely preoccupied with political infighting, which came to a climax in 1947 with the death of my first regent, Reting Rinpoche. So, by the time the People's Liberation Army was at the door in 1950, Tibet was completely unprepared, and it was too late. When I think about the political life of my immediate predecessor, the 13th Dalai Lama, there is a striking parallel with my own karma. Twice he was forced to flee into exile due to foreign invasion. First, when the British forces, under the command of Colonel Francis Younghusband, invaded Tibet in 1903, returning only in 1909, and then again in 1910, when the armies of the Manchu Qing dynasty attacked Tibet from the east. The British certainly hadn't come to stay, but it is very likely that conquest was the intention of the imperial Manchu forces. However, the Qing itself collapsed in 1911, and with the last emperor's abdication in 1912, the Qing Amban, the imperial representative in Lhasa, surrendered. It was after his return in 1913, as already stated, that the 13th Dalai Lama tried to assert Tibet's independence internationally, with acts such as the signing of a treaty with Mongolia in 1913, in which both states mutually affirmed each other's independence. This independence was the status of Tibet when Communist China invaded in 1950. If we Tibetans had read the signs correctly in those years, we might have seen that another invasion was likely. This strongly suggests that we missed our opportunities during the crucial period between the death of the 13th Dalai Lama in 1933 and the birth of Communist China in 1949. Especially amid the chaos of an unstable government and civil war in China. In fact, shortly before he died, the 13th Dalai Lama left an extraordinary and prophetic final testament. I read this text when I was young. Let me quote from it at length, since it shows both his foresight and the extent of the failure on the part of the Tibetan government to heed his very clear warnings. He wrote, "I am now almost 58 years old, and soon it will be impossible for me to serve you any longer. Everyone should realize this fact and begin to look to what you will do in the future when I am gone. Between me and the next incarnation, there will be a period in which you will have to fend for yourselves. Our two most powerful neighbors are India and China, both of whom have very powerful armies. Therefore, we must try to establish stable relations with both of them. There are also a number of small countries near our borders which maintain a strong military. Because of this, it is important that we too maintain an efficient army of young and well-trained soldiers that is able to establish the security of the country. If we do not make preparations to defend ourselves from the overflow of violence, we will have very little hope of survival. In particular, we must guard ourselves against the barbaric Red Communists who carry terror and destruction with them wherever they go. They are the worst of the worst. Already, they have consumed much of Mongolia. They have robbed and destroyed the monasteries, forcing the monks to join their armies, or else killing them outright. They have destroyed religion wherever they have encountered it. It will not be long before we find the red onslaught at our own front door. It is only a matter of time before we come into a direct confrontation with it. And when that happens, we must be ready to defend ourselves. Otherwise, our spiritual and cultural traditions will be completely eradicated. The monasteries will be looted and destroyed. The monks and nuns will be killed or chased away. the great works of the noble Dharma, kings of old, will be undone, and all of our cultural and spiritual institutions persecuted, destroyed, and forgotten. The birthrights and the property of the people will be stolen. We will become like slaves to our conquerors, and will be made to wander helplessly like beggars. Everyone will be forced to live in misery, and the days and nights will pass slowly, and with great suffering and terror. Therefore, when the strength of peace and happiness is with us, while the power to do something about the situation is still in our hands, we should make every effort to safeguard ourselves against this impending disaster. Use peaceful methods where they are appropriate, but where they are not appropriate, do not hesitate to resort to more forceful means. Work diligently now, while there is still time. Then there will be no regret. Tragically, the Regency and the Tibetan leadership, following the 13th Dalai Lama's death, failed to grasp the urgency and seriousness of his warning. Pretty much every aspect has proven to be precisely correct. When we think of the tragedy of Tibet in the wider global context, we see an extraordinary irony. Immediately after the Second World War, the imperial nations of the world were giving up their colonies everywhere. One thinks of the end of the British and French mandates in the Middle East in the late 1940s, and, of course, above all, of Indian independence in 1947, when all other imperial powers were divesting themselves of former colonies. Communist China was acquiring its own. The new Communist China chose to invade an independent country, Tibet, and make a colony out of it. In any case, the forcible inclusion of Tibet into Mao's new People's Republic of China has been disastrous not only for us Tibetans. It has also been problematic, to say the least, for China itself, for the imposition of a single Chinese nationhood over multiple nationalities, including Tibetans, each with its distinct language, culture, history, and people who have never viewed themselves as Chinese, created an inherently unstable modern state with a chronic threat of ethnic tension that perpetually requires brutal colonialist subjugation from Beijing. There is a second irony which might be characterized as ethical and moral. In December 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a fundamental document that lays the foundation upon which civilized societies in the modern world must treat their citizens and those of other countries. This declaration acquired a legal basis in 1976 as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, reaffirmed again in 2022. Communist China, in contrast, moved in the opposite direction. Almost immediately after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, China began what has been more than 70 years of systematic abuse of the human rights of the Tibetan people. Around the 50th anniversary of the UN Declaration, a few countries led by Communist China contended that the standards of human rights laid down in the Universal Declaration are not truly universal and do not apply to Asia because of the differences in culture, society, and economy. They argued that the concept of universal human rights needed to be revisited to accommodate what they referred to as Asian values. I stated that I do not share this view and argued that if any aspects of a culture or traditional customs were to conflict with respect for basic human rights, it is the traditional customs that need to be modified, not the other way around. I said that the majority of people in Asia would agree with me on this point. To be candid, I find the idea that somehow people in Asia do not value basic human rights, such as individual freedom and dignity, or that they do not need them, to be disrespectful toward the peoples of Asia. Anyway, Worried by this attempt to dilute the spirit of what is a seminal document in human history, I repeatedly argued that basic human rights are truly universal, for they pertain to the inherent nature of all human beings to yearn for freedom, equality, and dignity, and their right to achieve them. There is nothing west or east, north or south about this. I deeply believe that the principles laid down in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights constitute something like a natural law that ought to be followed by all peoples and governments. The cost of the conquest of Tibet for the Tibetan nation and its people is obvious, but it is worth thinking more broadly about the geopolitical effects in the region. To begin with, for the first time in history, the world's two most populated nations had a long border that had to be increasingly militarized. Up until this invasion of Tibet, there was only an Indo-Tibetan border, and no such thing as an Indo-Chinese border. In his letter to Prime Minister Nehru of November 7, 1950, shortly before his death, India's Deputy Prime Minister Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel lamented the expansion of China almost up to our gates. Throughout history, we have seldom worried about our northeast frontier. The Himalayas have been regarded as an impenetrable barrier against any threat from the north. We had friendly Tibet, which gave us no trouble. Just as Patel worried, there was a Sino-Indian War in 1962, followed by another conflict in 1967. Patel was more of a realist and pragmatist. By contrast, Nehru was more of an idealist and a visionary. The latter was worried about the world becoming too polarized between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the Warsaw Pact, and economically between the North and the South. His dream of a non-aligned collaboration led to the signing of the Panchsheel Agreement, literally 5 Principles Agreement, between India and China in 1954, which set out a plan for mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. In brief, the invasion and forcible occupation of Tibet has created long-term instability on the Tibetan Plateau, affecting a host of nations that traditionally relied on peace at their northern border: India, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. It is with this concern for peace and security in Asia in mind that I later made the suggestion in my 5-point peace plan of September 1987 that the Tibetan Plateau be turned into a demilitarized buffer zone between Asia's 2 largest military powers. Ecologically speaking, the Tibetan Plateau houses the source of many of Asia's greatest rivers, including Yarlung Tsangpo, Brahmaputra, and Senghe Kharbab, Indus, which flow southward, and Zashu, Mekong, Machu, Yellow River, and Drichu, Yangtze, which run east. The Communist Chinese occupation of Tibet has had a devastating effect on the health of these rivers, with significant environmental consequences to many countries in Asia. In the future too, unless responsible custodianship of the sources of these major rivers is ensured, there may be significant conflicts in connection with access to water, indispensable for the survival of hundreds of millions of people in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Some environmental specialists refer to the Tibetan Plateau as the third pole to add to the North and South poles, for reasons including it being the largest repository of fresh water. In addition, the ecosystem of the plateau plays a crucial role in the regulation of the monsoon across South Asia. China's mass deforestation in the Tibetan Plateau, aggressively carried out especially in the 1980s, is reported to have destroyed more than 50% of forests in calm, eastern Tibet, for example. Environmentalists are deeply concerned about the long-term negative impact of such extensive deforestation in the plateau, especially in relation to temperature increase and flooding during the monsoon in the lower regions. With respect to climate change, many years ago, an environmental scientist told me that, given Tibet's high altitude and dry climate, any ecological damage done on the plateau will take much longer to recover. The same scientist also told me about how Tibet's vast northern plains, Jungthang, plays a crucial role in cooling the temperature through reflecting the sun's light instead of absorbing it. One of the greatest sources of concern is the construction of megadams such as the one at Yamdrok Lake and the Zangmu Dam in the Loka region, close to the border of Bhutan. Today, we know from environmental science that there is a connection between earthquakes and the construction of dams in the high-altitude Tibetan Plateau, given that the region is one of the most seismically active areas in the world. The Tibetan Plateau is also known for its vast mineral deposits. According to China's own Geological Survey Bureau, the plateau is understood to have reserves of 30 to 40 million tons of copper, more than 40 million tons of zinc, and billions of tons of iron, including especially large deposits of rare minerals such as lithium and uranium. In fact, the Chinese word for Tibet, Xizang, literally means Western Treasure House. If mining is done at all in the Tibetan Plateau, it has to be conducted in accord with the highest sensitivity to environmental impact. In the end, a careless, instrumental, or mercantile approach to extraction will lead to long-term consequences, which will be experienced way beyond the boundaries of the Tibetan Plateau. Lastly, there has been a large-scale forced migration of nomads from their traditional grasslands in different parts of the Tibetan Plateau. Historically, Tibet's nomadic communities have lived in the vast open plains, including the grasslands, and have developed a symbiotic relationship with their environment, such that their presence on the vast open space has served as the best form of caretaking for the ecology. Displacements of these traditional nomadic communities have not only been devastating for the nomads, but also they have created a new cycle of imbalance in the environment. I had hoped, given that ecological health is a concern common to Tibetans as well as the Chinese, that the protection of Tibet's fragile environment would be one area where one could see systematic and sustained joint efforts. If the Chinese authorities were to allow environmental scientists, including especially Chinese scientists, to work hand in hand with local Tibetans who know their environment best, there is the possibility of creating an effective approach to reducing unnecessary ecological damage on the plateau. I was told that a noted Chinese environmental scientist who had spent many years in Tibet has commented that where religious tradition is strongest, the environment is well protected, and this is something that should give us pause for thought. Historically, with our cultural and religious practices that emphasize living in harmony with nature, Tibet's natural environment, including flora and fauna, had never suffered excessive abuse at the hands of the human inhabitants of the vast plateau. Very worryingly, there are many reports that Communist China has installed nuclear missiles in the high altitude of the Tibetan Plateau. Setting aside the implications for regional and international stability, the risk of leaks or mistakes carries a devastating threat to the fragile ecology. Were the waters of the rivers to be polluted, the destructive impact on the lives of many millions dependent on these rivers cannot be calculated. When you take all these issues together, the militarization of the Tibetan Plateau, which includes the stationing of nuclear weapons, an increasing security face-off between two of Asia's largest armies across more than 3,000 kilometers of border, of which some crucial parts remain disputed, and ecological destruction of the plateau through deforestation and extensive mining, as well as unpredictable management of the sources of some of Asia's greatest rivers, on whom the livelihoods of hundreds of millions depend, the invasion of Tibet has been truly tragic, not just for the Tibetans, but for the whole of humanity too. It is a tragedy of historic proportions whose destructive fallout will continue to reverberate through the centuries. Had Tibet been able to remain free, these geopolitical and ecological problems would not exist. This is the plain truth.